Welcome everyone to this special episode of All Things Policy, and not just to our listeners but to our viewers as well, because we are uploading this on YouTube and we have Bodhi Dharma in the background. So, what more appropriate question can we discuss than China? So, Anushka is there with me, and we are going to discuss one topic that's been doing a lot of rounds in the news of late, and that is China's overcapacity. And there are a lot of articles which have come out in various publications. So we thought we'll talk about what is this overcapacity, why is this overcapacity a significant part of the Chinese ecosystem, and probably what are its implications on India specifically. So let's get started. Anushka, go ahead. What do you think?
Right. So, as many of you might already know, in the past couple years, um, countries have kind of quickly allowed the trade war that was initiated between the US and China in the erstwhile Donald Trump administration to snowball into a war that is technological at its core. And that has led countries to engage in all sorts of defensive trade measures, import restrictions, and movement of equipment, talent, and investments to and from China, right? And they've largely used national security related justifications for such maneuvers.
Right.
But now this idea of overcapacity that you mentioned is so much in the news, is making so many rounds in the news, has come about as this beautiful economic logic to explain some of these measures and maneuvers. And if we just look at what European Union Commission President Ursula von der Leyen had to say about this, the case she's making against the EU's, in favor of the EU's anti-subsidy investigations against China, or the massive import tariffs being imposed on the imports of Chinese new electric vehicles. The basic argument is this: that China has been historically a surplus producer because its domestic market is saturated. It's integrated itself deeply into the global economy, and that has also led international markets to be flooded with Chinese goods, and many of them are cheaper and more low cost than maybe domestic alternatives in some of these countries, because the Chinese state heavily invests in subsidizing them and creating creating ease in production. And now it's kind of at the point where China is producing much more than perhaps global markets and even the domestic market can consume. And this is what's maybe motivating entities like the EU or countries like Canada and the US to hike up import tariffs on Chinese EVs to as much as 100%. And I think this kind of economic logic is going to continue in the long run, as long as these concerns surrounding overcapacity and the non-willingness of the Chinese state to address it will continue.
Yeah, that's right. So, like you said, initially the concern was largely framed in national security terms, like Huawei. You should not have companies like Huawei in your core network infrastructure because these are really core to your information space. And if it is in the hands of an adversary, there can be other consequences. So, that was the first round of sort of backlash against China's dominance in many of the sectors. And the recent round, the argument, as you said, especially in electric vehicles, for example, I don't think anyone can make the argument electric vehicles are strategic to our national security. But the argument that has been made is that China structurally is sort of prone to overcapacity, and that has negative consequence on firm capacity domestically, and that's why you need to defend against it. Right? Now, on this view, right? Actually, Anushka, I think I have changed my mind a bit on this. Initially, I mean, as because we are all followers of what Anupam teaches us in economic theory, we always largely do agree that as long as China has the comparative advantage in producing something, and if we are getting it for cheap, we should be open to it in every way. We should not be bothered about the fact that China is producing something cheaply, because if it is producing, say, machine tools cheaply, Indian firms can then buy those machine tools and build some great products on top of it. So net, it is a positive sum game. They benefit, their machine tool producers benefit, and our companies which use those machine tools to produce great products also benefit. So that was my framing. But after reading some of these things, I think there is some grain of truth that we should think more about how China is structurally prone to overcapacity, and that does have some negative consequences on the world's firms. And that doesn't mean you have to close everything that comes in from China, but I think there is some grain of truth in thinking about at least isolating us from the worst effects of this kind of overcapacity, and also be able to take advantage of some of the things that are coming out of China. So that's how I would put it. But one thing that I think a lot of these people have been arguing is that overcapacity is structural to China's model. So let's discuss that. Do you have anything to say on that?
Right. I think uh, in the context of a lot of discussions on the structural slowdown in the Chinese economy, the idea that the economy is structurally slowing down and it's not kind of a cyclical event and there's going to be a snapback very quickly. All of this is based on the idea that the Chinese economy has been planned in a manner since the reform era to favor certain drivers of growth and ignore certain others. And it's structural in the sense that this economic slowdown is not one where these drivers have just periodically slowed down or impacted the economy and they're going to come right back up, but they've slowed down because of issues and concerns that have been continuing and have just burst up to the surface because of a lot of factors like the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic, the prolonged lockdown, so on and so forth. So in that sense, it's structural. And why it's right to make the case, in my opinion, that overcapacity is a structural Chinese issue is because China is the kind of economy that runs an export surplus. And it's also a quasi-dictatorial state, which means that the Chinese state has massive control over the economy. What that means is that it can use its authority to suppress the consumer's need to spend more and rather emphasize investments towards the process of production. And since the reform era in the late 1970s, we're seeing that the 5-year plans, which kind of create the backbone of economic planning in the country, they've emphasized on making China an export-driven economy. And that just doesn't mean that export is the highest contributor by percentage to GDP, but it also means that other sectors in the economy are kind of shaped in a manner that they benefit exports.
Yeah.
So that would mean consumption, even real estate and foreign direct investment abroad. All of them are meant to kind of help firms boost production capability. And that's why it's very difficult overnight to bring about other drivers of GDP, such as maybe consumption or investment, to kind of replace that export-oriented growth.
Yeah.
That structure.
So, I mean, to add that, some things we already know, like there is financial repression in China that as you were mentioning, that at the expense of households, there is a focus on investment and not so much on household consumption. The other thing that we know is, of course, export exchange rates have also been kept low to facilitate higher exports. So these are things we know. But overcapacity in a structural way, this Manoj and I were writing an article, and one thing which we don't realize is, I think decentralization has a lot of role to play in this. So the way it works is, it's not very well understood. But for example, in China, the system is not federal, but it is highly decentralized, at least fiscally. So the way it worked is, this is 2014-15 data, and 51% of government expenditure happens at sub-provincial levels. The equivalent number for India is 3 to 5%. Right? So now, what does this have to do with overcapacity? Right? So in 1994, there was this tax sharing reform. Until then, once this Dang's famous Southern tour happened, a lot of local governments became enthusiastic about spending on all sorts of things, and they went on a spree. So then there was this tax sharing reform, which essentially made local government spending from the money that the central government was giving to them difficult. But local governments had to find a way out, right? Because their responsibilities were still very huge. For example, for an Indian context, it will seem very different that most of unemployment insurance in China happens at provincial and sub-provincial levels. Pensions also. We are used to talking about UPS and NPS now, which is largely we're talking from a union government and state level. But here, these are issues which actually the local government is. And apart from defense, I think there's no other area in which local governments don't have a role.
Actually, as per some of the new and revised regulations on military veterans resettlement, the provinces where these veterans have their huko or household registration, the governments of those provinces are responsible for either getting them resettlement jobs or for taking care of their pensions.
Yeah, so I mean, military pensions or etc. are also in the realm of local. So this is like so fundamentally different from the Indian model. Now, what this happens is generally we think all decentralization is good decentralization, but that is not the case. So this model sort of worked very well for China in this sense. So after 1994, once the central government restricted their funding scope, what the local governments did is the only way to make money is investment-led growth, right? So what they would say is, remember in China there is no private property tax also. So local governments couldn't just put property tax and try to make money. So the way they did this is give land parcels at very cheap rates, a lot of corruption, etc. But still, what they did is invite a large number of companies to set up base with the hope that once these firms start up, they will become over the long term sources of tax revenue for the local government. And remember, this is fundamental because if your GDP growth is higher, the officers there have a higher likelihood of getting promoted in the Chinese party state hierarchy. So GDP growth rate is their main obsession, and to get to that obsession, investment led growth was the model. And to get investment, the way you would do is give land parcels at very cheap rate to companies to start production. Do whatever you want to produce, doesn't matter, but just produce so that I can show a higher GDP growth number. Now, this is structural to overcapacity, right? So the central government was not saying that you do overcapacity, but the central government would set broad targets that the textiles are important, whatever, and local governments will just chase investments in this. And there was a lot of competition, right? And until now, the way it worked was largely there were negative aspects, positive aspects, but positive aspects were overweighing the negative aspects. So there was largely some competition, some states tried to do a SCZ kind of model. Some states tried to chase textiles, some states tried to chase toys, etc. So largely because of competition, you had a situation in which you could produce a lot of things. And obviously, you can't absorb that in China, which wasn't so rich. So exports were very important. And the way exports were kept important is yes, exchange rate was kept low. And I think another very important part was the geopolitics was favorable, right? So because you had a situation where China was in the WTO, and there was also this situation that largely the world was welcoming of Chinese products, so China could just use this overcapacity and export it. There was the negative consequences of it weren't felt. But over the last few years, that has changed. One, because of China's own international conduct, it is being seen, its products are being seen in this negative terms, like we were talking about EVs. So that geopolitics is not favorable. And like you also mentioned, it is not possible to substitute the foreign export demand with domestic demand. They have been trying with high quality growth, etc. But still, there's a difference, right? Earlier, we were exporting to countries with the GDP of $64,000 per capita, and now China is still at whatever 10,000, 12,000. Right? There's still a huge difference. The other way they have tried to do is find other export markets, like through the BRI, etc. But the kind of countries which have subscribed to BRI cannot substitute the demand which exists in the US, EU, etc. So I think this is how we think overcapacity is a structural effect. Now we can say it is. So what? It is structural, but does it have an adverse consequence on other countries? Probably, in the sense that because China is subsidizing these, it's not market oriented comparative advantage that is necessary. Like in some areas it is, but in many areas it is because of this reason that you are getting land for free. There's a lot of uh, political economy reasons why your products are actually cheaper. So when those products come into your own jurisdiction, there might be conditions where your own firms which were building capacity or have existing capacity already are not able to compete because of these drivers in China. And they are even growing further, right? Because what do they do with this overcapacity, especially in EVs? So they can really undercut a lot of firms just on prices, and that might affect firm capacity. So that is how it is, and that's why I've sort of done a Bayesian updation of how do we think about overcapacity.
Right. And I think some of what you said about local government financing has also then led, and this is in tandem with the central government in China, where there has been leeway for local governments to engage in off-the-book debt by easing the use of financial instruments by private sectors and private sector firms. And because these investments, like you said, are extremely crucial for the growth of local governments, even though at this juncture, around $800 billion of the $7 to $11 trillion in debt of the book debt on the local governments is unserviceable, they still feel, and this is another way this is structural, right? They still feel that this manipulation of financial instruments is the way to go forward to ease some of the debt pressures. And like you said, the Chinese party state is a system where the central leadership will issue certain guidelines on what national priorities are, and then the system will have some room to innovate around those guidelines, and then the success or the failure of the innovation will become either a step to go higher or go lower.
Yeah, I think this is one point that Manoj brought to the table when we were discussing. His idea was that the directives that central government gives has also changed over time. So earlier, until the Hu Jintao period, largely the directives were very broad, and then you could have local governments sort of competing in one way or the other. But in this situation, recently what we are seeing is that actually the directives are becoming much more narrower. So, for example, when we talk about semiconductors, the government is saying not just that local governments do various things, but they are trying to become full on Atmanirbhar, trying to become self reliant across the supply chain, which means that it might not even be China's comparative advantage. Let's say manufacturing equipment might not be a comparative advantage, and yet they are trying to manufacture it locally, which means they don't have the cost advantages existed in the past. There's a lot of data on this. For example, Chinese made chips are 30% costlier than foreign owned chips, and they can just import it. But because of this full-on drive towards Atmanirbharta, they are doing things which actually shouldn't be produced in China. So this is one more way in which overcapacity is playing.
Those are really good points, Pranay. But just to kind of take the discussion in a direction away from how governments, especially the Chinese government and Western countries' governments, how their policy maneuvers have played out on this discussion on overcapacity, towards a discussion on how this will impact private enterprises. Of course, let's imagine, you're Elon Musk and you've established a factory for electric vehicle production or Tesla hybrids in Shanghai, and you've gone there with the dream of exploiting a lot of the cost advantages that come with producing in China, such as subsidized land costs, relatively low labor costs, and of course the fact that there's an excellent back-end supply chain for easy availability of new and critical components for automobile production, right? But even if Tesla, which is an American company, will try and export products made in Shanghai, China, the same 36% EU tariffs or the 100% Canadian import tariffs or even the American tariffs are going to apply, largely because of the idea of rules of origin. And so, in this regard, what do you think the impacts will be on how private sectors function, and the fact that you alluded to the idea that the geopolitical environment in maybe the 70s, when the world was opening up to China, was different. One of the reasons was because businesses were looking for locations, offshore locations for cheaper production. Today, businesses may be looking for cheaper productions that are not China, even though China exported it advantage. So, how are then private sector entities supposed to react to this, and how can they either shape or be impacted by policy?
Yeah. So for a firm, I mean, the firms also have to do geopolitical risk analysis, and this all the trends now which are moving are towards making firms realize that investing in China, especially in cutting edge areas, is not as okay as it was in the past. Right? So even though we are seeing exports rising in the recent years from China, but that is an outcome of this structural overcapacity. But over time, we know that, especially in the tech world, a lot of companies are aligning with their governments to a higher extent than they were doing in the past. Right? So Intel's stance is a case in point. They were very gung ho on China, investing in Tsinghua Uni Group, which was one of the leading design houses in China, etc. But over time, when this narrative started coming up, the geopolitics and competition between US and China heated up. And then there were various kinds of industrial policies in US and other countries. So they have found alternatives in other countries, or Intel is building a fab in Germany, but they will not do that in China. If they do it, they'll get a lot of backlash. It was earlier it would have been so what, yeah, I mean, go and do that. But now it will be perceived very differently in the US and other countries. So other firms will try to find a way out of China. I don't think they can completely get away from it, because all this, it's like these are capacities which don't get created instantaneously. I think that's why also we have to think about overcapacity differently, right? So just because if you already have an existing firm and you have Chinese low price products coming in and your firm dissolves, that capacity will take time to build. It's not as if that capacity can be built tomorrow by another startup. So from that sense, China also has existing capacity, experience. They know the recipe of building a lot of things. So firms cannot suddenly get out of China, but they are trying to the extent possible. So that's why firms are either trying that China plus one strategy, trying to diversify to places where the geopolitics is not that heated up. So I think that's what I would try to look at least at the highest tech, cutting edge of tech. Just get out of China. At the lower cutting edge where China has a cost advantage, find another diversification strategy, find another players, and then slowly try to reduce the dependence on China.
Right. I think that's a very kind of useful model for firms to approach this question with. But at the same time, I also think that some firms or some business venturists may kind of agree with the defense or the explanation the Chinese provide against the argument of overcapacity, which is that it may be alarming for overcapacity to exist in what they refer to as the kind of low quality or low criticality sectors, maybe consumer goods, food, beverages, so on and so forth, right? But in critical and high technology sectors, EVs for some countries, other things like semiconductors, materials and equipment, so on and so forth, overcapacity is actually underutilization by a market that isn't mature enough to understand that they will have a demand of these high technology and critical goods in the future. So, Professor Lu Feng of the Peking University in China, and also one of the advisors of China's Ministry of Finance, has made the case recently that it's not so much overcapacity as it is underutilization by external markets that exists in Chinese sectors like EVs, and because the EV production sector in China believes that the demand is going to rise in the coming years, this what we're perceiving as overcapacity today will actually be meeting the demand tomorrow. Now, this absolutely isn't the case with things like solar PVs, solar photovoltaic cells, for example, because a Bloomberg research recently has suggested that China produces as much as twice, or will produce as much as twice as the demand that the world can absorb. But maybe in EVs, this would come to be true as more financing is directed by countries towards climate sustainability.
Yeah, but I think the way you would determine this is if they are expecting higher demands in the future, then one, all of their stock prices should be growing up, all of their profits should be going up, because that's the expectation. But that's not the case in recent times, right? So even in the there is data that largest number of loss-making firms in China since the 1998 Asian financial crisis are now. This is Chinese government data. More than so that itself shows that they are producing. There's no other way out. The only way to the model is like the pathway they have taken is the only way out is keep producing more and keep selling it more. Even if the others are not buying it, then reduce the prices so that you still keep producing and getting it out. So that's how the photovoltaic cells, etc., will also be very cheap. An Indian firm or an American firm will not be able to compete, but the Chinese firm will keep reducing the price because there's no other way out. Right? So, if its profits of all companies were still increasing, then what the argument Professor Fung made would hold true. But I don't think that is the case.
Right. Pranay, you made a point earlier about diversification and firms kind of making the decisions to at least reroute new investments, if not existing ones, in China to countries where maybe the geopolitical play isn't as tense. And of course, the discussion on India as the next China, the fact that businesses are looking to India as an alternative, along with many competitors, of course, such as Vietnam and Mexico, as one of the places where these supply chains can be rerouted, is again a discussion happening in quantities simultaneously with the discussions on overcapacity. And I know for a fact that you've developed a model, which kind of a four-quadrant model that kind of tries to explain what India's approach should be, and uh, the kind of the parameters to consider are the capabilities of Indian firms and the strategic criticality of a particular sector. Can you maybe delve into it for our listeners and viewers?
Yeah. So the question was, one is you want to be a part of China plus one, and that's why the government has done things like the production linked incentives, etc. And we have our arguments about that, whether that's the right policy instrument. But generally, the government understands that China plus one is an opportunity, and you need to do certain things to become to get a greater chunk of this China plus one model. That's one part of it. But I think the more important question is, what should India's response to Chinese overcapacity be? Right? And this is a fundamental question, I think, all countries are facing, and it's a question for us also. Now, why is it an important question for us, and how is it different from, say, EU, etc.? Right? Now, at the cutting edge, EU and other countries already have some capabilities, but we are in a situation where we are below capability in many things China does. Right? So now you can't put a full-on blanket, import uh, ban regime for things coming from China, because you need those products to build on top of. Like, for example, if India wants to export iPhones, it will need sophisticated machines. Now those machines don't exist in China. Will we say don't get it from China? Then it will require 10 years for a firm to start building that capability. By that time, our iPhone story is over. So you can't do that. So what should be our strategy is question is different from the constraints and challenges that EU or US face. And China is also a big adversary. So geopolitically also a different question. Now, economic survey kicked off this discussion in recent times. Earlier, there was largely the status quo was that after the Galwan Valley crisis and then this FDI rule which came in, it was largely closed. And even if you need to get Chinese, say, talent means 20, 30 engineers, not even a big number, it was very restrictive. And economic survey said that you should not do that. You should probably think about opening up to Chinese investments, right? So that was what the economic survey said. But I was trying to think, what are the sectors in which we should go? What are there some sectors in which we should be open to investment, talent, products, or and are there some sectors in which we should only be open to investment? How do we think about it? Right. So one way I was thinking about it is based on this overcapacity uh, trend, and that's why I thought the two important factors that Indian government has to consider is, one is the strategic criticality of the sector. How important is that sector to our national security? Because if it is not important, it's okay to be more liberal on Chinese imports, right? So, and if it is strategically critical, you can be more restrictive on certain things. So that is one important factor to consider.
Sorry, quickly. So would EVs be an example of strategic criticality?
No, I wouldn't. I think most semiconductors are also not strategically critical, right? It's as long as it is like something which is super core. For example, small modular reactors are strategically critical, right? There are many sort of downstream consequences to importing it from another country. So those I would say are strategically critical, not things like EVs, etc. Right? So that is strategic criticality. The other axis which is important comes from the overcapacity idea. That do you already have existing capacity? The way I think you could measure it is, are there sectors in which your firms already export to the world? Because export is a measure of whether you are able to compete in the world, and you have built capacity over time. Now you don't want to lose that capacity, right? So if you allow a free flow of Chinese overcapacity, which is undercut by various subsidies to come in into the areas where you have existing capacity, you will lose out on precious firm capacity, which will again take 10 years to build. So that's why it is another important factor. Now, at the intersection of these two factors, there will be some areas where, the sort of strategic criticality will be high, but let's say your existing capacity is also strong. Let's say that area, right? So I was thinking which could be those areas. For probably core network infrastructure could be these. Pharma APIs are also areas where India has some firm capacity, and it is also strategically critical. So in these areas, I think there is ample sort of the reason for us to be skeptical of Chinese investment, Chinese, even restrict movement of Chinese talent, and Chinese products also. Right. So I'm okay if there are some tariffs on these. I wouldn't have said this a few months ago, but I think I'll be okay because your firm capacity will go away with this. So that is one. But there will be also areas where there are, the strategic criticality is low, and you don't even have an existing firm capability. So, for example, I would say EV cells or machining tools are these areas. So, in that, it's okay to be open to Chinese investment, to Chinese talent, to Chinese products, right? Because then our companies can build on top of those products. So, then there are other two quadrants in which the strategic criticality is high, but our existing capacity is low. Now, in those areas, I would be okay to ban imports because you don't want a strategically critical component to come from your adversary, but you can encourage incoming investments. This is what the economic survey was saying. So it's okay if those firms we are able to learn technology, do technology transfers from them, learn from the things that China has already learned from the West, and quickly build that capability at home. So, and then the fourth quadrant will be where we have a strong firm capacity, existing capacity, but the strategic criticality is low. In those areas, I would say steel, electric vehicles, solar panels, consumer electronics are probably those areas. In that, I'm okay with some tariffs, but again, encouraging incoming investment is important. Joint ventures are important, and enable tech transfers through lateral movement of talent. So all these are important. So I think the areas that I have put in are not very well defined. I think I'm okay if people say EV cells are probably we are areas where we have some capacity. Maybe we have. I'm wrong there. But at least this is one way where we are able to get to a more nuanced thinking on how we should approach Chinese overcapacity instead of just thinking in terms of import bans and saying everything is strategically important and hence we don't want China in it.
Right. And I think in a sense, then this framework kind of also builds really well upon the idea that we've discussed often at Takshashila via Amit Kumar's framework on dependence and vulnerability, where it's not just important to treat all dependence as vulnerability, but also differentiate between strategically vulnerable, critically vulnerable, and mere dependence related sectors. And then once kind of maybe India's kind of taken that exercise up, we could put some of these products or some of these sectors in these quadrants, assess capability and assess criticality, and then basically add the capability parameter to the criticality parameter and make policy decisions instead of just attaching a PLI to every possible product.
Yeah, but there's a difference between vulnerability and criticality also. Like, for example, we are vulnerable if you're buying, say, 90% of the thing from China. Or it can be something, I don't know, if electric vehicles from China were allowed in India, you could say you are vulnerable to China because it is supplying 90% of the product. But criticality means how important is it to your national security? That is also an important dimension. And even though you might be 90% dependent on, let's say, toys from China, and it is probably the only producer of those kinds of toys, but it might not be critical to your national goals or national security. And then you can have a different strategy in this sector where we're largely talking about how do you tackle its products, tackle investments and talent coming in from that country.
Right. Pranay, we've had an interesting chat so far, but I think a few final thoughts and questions on the framework that you've talked about, and I encourage our listeners and viewers to build upon this and give us their feedback on how this can be refined better for the Indian government to kind of adopt. But if I go back to the example of Tesla that I was talking about earlier, and we see, for example, that because of the negative image of products produced in China, an American company will still be kind of taxed for its exports outside of China. And wouldn't you then say that if India's goal is similar to China in the sense that we also
Sorry, you said taxed out of China, as in when India is importing?
No, when products from, say, a Tesla factory in China go out into the world, by tax, I mean there are import restrictions placed on
import
them.
Tariffs.
Yeah, import tariffs placed on them. If, for example, India has a similar investment from, say, a Chinese firm or Chinese talent, or kind of come in and enable production in the country, or even or if we're even importing Chinese components and then building upon them to build our own export capacity, and kind of send those products out into the world, wouldn't you say we might face similar challenges given the kind of negative image attached with China? These could be concerns related to rules of origin. I mean, countries are finding unique ways to place such restrictions on exports. Right?
Yeah, I think we'll get there once that problem arises. Right now, the gain you get is you build capability which you didn't have. So if there is a Chinese firm which you are able to invest in India, you achieve two goals. One, you get some technology transfer, because we are seeing this in solar industry, right? All the PLI winners, whether it is the Reliance Group or the Adani Group, the subcontractors for all those or implementers of those projects are Chinese firms. So, if those Chinese firms are able to invest in India, we build capability, these firms know it, and in the next round, these people who have learned will do things on their own. Right? So, you are just like how China used the West to build their own capability, we should be willing to use Chinese investment. So, that is one. The second thing is, once Chinese investment happens in India, and this is a point Swaminathan Iyer has made a lot of times, that the risk is on of Chinese firms.
Right.
They will be fearful of what is happening in India. So if they are willing to do that, we should be okay with it. Let the risk is theirs to have. And anyways, India is not an easy place to do business in. So the risk is theirs. Let them come in, and we should be okay to quickly learn. And then next round, you will have lesser dependence on China just because you have quickly learned from them.
Right. So maybe the BYD mega joint venture to produce EVs in India would have.
Yeah,
perhaps been
I
a good
think
idea.
we should have been open to all types of joint production. I am okay even if those are not 50-50%, even if the ownership is with the Chinese entity. But as long as there are certain conditions put in, we can ensure that we build capability.
Right. Some very important takeaways for me from this conversation. Overcapacity definitely exists and is a structural issue, and a lot of factors, including the saturation of domestic demand, the supply glut in the external demand, and of course the low profitability of Chinese firms. All of them indicate to this challenge being structural, which is why India then needs to pick and choose policy measures in a manner that there are some sectors delineated to build capabilities, some where we can simply invite Chinese investment talent and firms to kind of build, teach, and produce. And of course, then there'll be some sectors where our capabilities will be high, and so will be the strategic criticality or the value of that sector to national security will be higher. And so there, perhaps we can follow a model similar to maybe the US or the EU and have higher import tariffs and actually securitize those issues, thereby kind of shifting, diversifying or broadening the order window of policy measures. So thanks for that, Pranay. Really interesting stuff. And hope to keep the conversation going. Although, just to end on a high note, I'd like to encourage our viewers and listeners to take the China Challenge survey till the 31st of August. It's your opportunity to shape India's policy on China and share with us your critical opinions. People's voices matter, and Takshashila is attempting to give you a platform through this survey. And of course, your insights will be absolutely critical for our research as well. So, thank you, and
Jai Hind.
to Jai Hind.